Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. Today we're joined by Mr. Ali Al-Saffar, Middle East and North Africa Programme Manager from the International Energy Agency, IEA. Ali, thanks very much for being with us today. I'd like to start with climate change, of course. As we move to a world of net zero CO2 emissions, it's safe to assume that consumption of fossil fuels will diminish. But the demand, ironically, for energy is increasing, particularly in the less developed countries and also a developed country in China, of course. So perhaps more fossil fuels will be needed. How can we resolve this issue should it arise in the coming years?
Thank you, Stephen, and it's good to be here with you. Thank you for having me on. Well, it's as you said, what we know is that the world needs to move towards a lower emissions future. It's what the scientists have told us. It's what the world has kind of agreed on, both at Paris, but hopefully also in the lead up to COP26, which will happen in November. And of course, covering the energy sector, we feel that the energy sector has a really large part to play in this because it's in one way or another responsible for the bulk of man-made emissions today. So in other words, we really need to fundamentally alter both the way we produce, but also the way we consume energy, but doing this in a way that also ensures that our economies are not harmed and that livelihoods can continue to improve, while at the same time bringing down the emissions that have traditionally been part and parcel of this equation. But it's really important to establish here, Stephen, that that's not the trajectory we're on today. We're not on a net zero trajectory, despite the numerous pledges that we see coming and being made. So without a concerted policy shift, we're expecting, for example, in the International Energy Agency, that oil demand will increase by around 10 million barrels a day by 2040. We're a really long way away from where we need to be. If I may, I'll put this in a slightly different way. The countries that have pledged net zero cover around 70% of global CO2 emissions. Now, if we take for granted that all of these succeed, and that's already quite a heroic assumption, but let's say all of these pledges succeed, that would still leave around 22 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. That would translate to around a 2.1 degree increase in temperature by 2100, so way beyond what our target is. Now, at the IEA, we've presented one pathway, one potential pathway to net zero. It's not, the only pathway, but we think that we've done quite a comprehensive job in trying to outline what it could mean. But this pathway basically takes into consideration both economic growth and, as you've kind of posited, the issue of energy access. Now, in that pathway, we propose ways to decouple economic growth from energy consumption. So while the global economy continues to grow to around by around 40% more than it is today by 2030, it uses around 7% less energy. Now, of course, I think everybody agrees global warming is a problem that affects all of humanity. By definition, it's a global issue. And so we need to just make sure that we find solutions that allows everybody to pull in the same direction. And that's not going to happen if the world's poorest are being asked to shoulder a burden that's above what they can do. If it's an outsized burden, it's not going to happen, especially when the world's poorest have contributed almost nothing to the problem in the first place. So today, what we do know is that there are around 785 million people without access to electricity. There are around 2.6 billion people without clean cooking access. And this has been central to a lot of our work for the last 2 decades at the IEA. We've always tried to see what the best possible solutions for access for these people are. And we found that even in a net zero scenario, the additional investment that would be needed to bring access to these people is around $40 billion every year. This sounds like a lot, but that's just 1% of overall energy sector investments. It's not that much, and that would bring us in line with SDG 7. So it's not, it's not a far cry from where we could be. Now, in our roadmap, again, like I said, we do take these people into consideration. We take access into consideration, and we find that there are possible pathways that are low carbon that that could bring access to these people at the lowest cost. So, for example, we do really granular analysis on power grids in Africa and Southeast Asia, and we found that mini grids and standalone solutions could basically be the least cost option for around 55% of those that would be required to get access to electricity. So there is a way to do this that is commensurate with net zero, and that doesn't really increase CO2 emissions. It's just about doing it in a way that joins up economic and energy imperatives in one.
That's an absolutely brilliant answer, Ali. I have to say, it's so full and so interesting to get such clear analysis, economic analysis especially, and certainly you're right about the effect on the world's poor of climate change and how much money is going to be needed to affect those changes. But the Middle East, as you know, and you mentioned the economic background to this, has a rentier economy, and this can bring unique challenges in the future. If there is less demand for the region's commodities, how can its governments respond to ensure economic stability and what all the politicians want, growth?
Stephen, this is perhaps the most important question for the oil and gas producers in the Middle East and North Africa. It's not just an environmental issue. It's not just it becomes an economic and social stability issue at the end of the day. So let's start by detailing kind of the size of the risk to export markets that would be presented by a net zero trajectory, at least in the roadmap that we've presented. So in the net zero roadmap that we've presented, oil demand drops to around 24 million barrels a day by 2050. And this is compared to around 100 million barrels a day today. So that will obviously impact revenues, not only because demand is lower and the number of barrels you're producing and exporting goes down, but also because one would expect that there's going to be a price effect as well. So you get hit on volumes and price, and the overall revenue decreases. Now, the bulk of the solution to this is not found in the energy sector. The bulk of the solution is economic diversification. And that is not something that's new to this region. It's something that countries have aspired to for decades. If you go to national development plans in the most prominent oil and gas producers in the region, this has been identified as an objective going back to 1970. But more needs to be done, and there needs to be concerted efforts in this direction. Now, one of the vagaries of policies in the Middle East and North Africa region is that generally the kind of stress on economic diversification is strongest when oil prices are low, and it's weakest when oil prices recover. And when oil prices are low and the impetus for economic diversification is high, countries don't have the revenues to push that diversification strategy. And when oil prices recover, the kind of that pressure to diversify and to reform is alleviated, and these diversification efforts usually fall by the wayside. So last year there was a huge hit to oil markets, a really large hit to revenues in oil and gas producers in the MENA region, and we heard a lot about economic diversification, about the need for economic reform. Yesterday, the price of Brent hit 80 for the first time in a few years. This is going to basically be the barometer of whether these economic diversification strategies are going to endure this time around. And I think it's a really, really interesting thing to keep an eye on. So, the bulk of the issue is going to be on the broader economy. It's going to be on things like making sure that the business environment is better, that investors feel secure, that private investment is encouraged. But the energy sector could also play a role. Now, countries across the region, and I can talk about this a bit later on if you prefer, but countries in the region, they've established a competitive advantage in the production and the export of energy that goes back decades. And that competitive advantage is in things like the management of the energy sector, but it's also in supply chains as well. And we're trying to examine ways to harness that competitiveness towards lower carbon energy forms in the future. And we're working at the moment with several countries across the region on this very issue. Now, if the world transitions away from fossil fuel use before the producers transition their economies, then that could be a recipe for instability. Because if the economies are not diversified by the time demand weakens to the extent where it's hitting revenues, then it could spell quite considerable pressure and trouble for oil and gas producers in the MENA region.
Now, in a recent paper, you noted the impact of higher temperatures and possible water shortages lead to food scarcity. You mentioned bread as a barometer. Now, does that make it a case of self-interest for Middle Eastern countries to tackle climate change? So, what are the measures needed in the Middle East to combat climate change?
It is absolutely an issue of self-interest. They've got skin in the game. I mean, not only are they, responsible global actors here, but if you look at the impacts of climate and the warming that's happening, it's concentrated quite severely in the Middle East and North Africa region. Our region now is going through its worst drought in 900 years. It's been in a state of almost perpetual drought for the last 2 decades. Temperatures in Qatar have already risen by 2 degrees since pre-industrial times, and it's barely warming because the waters around the country don't cool down anymore. Iraq, a big producer with untold issues, is warming at a rate of up to 7 times the global average. So it's not just that they need to be part of a global conversation. This matters to them at home, and it's got very real impact. So what can they do? Well, there's a number of things that can be done. Now, first of all, the way energy is consumed in the region could change. They could do their own part towards the energy transition, and there are several kind of key elements here. The first is a move towards renewable. I don't think that that's in any way that in any way clashes with their development drive or reduces their competitiveness. In fact, if we see the fact that the Middle East and North Africa region is basically blessed with levels of solar irradiations that are among the best in the world.
Well, that's right. I mean, these are the alternative, perhaps, fuel sources, which could be used for domestic energy consumption. And that would allow fossil fuels to be released for export. Is that valid and is it economically viable?
I think it's valid and economically viable under certain terms. So what I was saying about solar resources, right now, the region is almost an outlier in the world for still relying quite heavily on oil use for power generation. Oil is very, when used for power generation, it can be very polluting. It's also very expensive. Our studies have shown that even priced at $40 per barrel, solar is competitive with most oil-fired power generation in the region. So it is, both from an economic perspective, better. The opportunity cost for the barrel is higher if it's exported, but also if that's exported and then used in an industry where the emissions could be abated a little bit more easily, then there's also second order effects as well. But I just wanted to put into perspective just how little we're making use of solar in the region. So it accounted for around 1% of total electricity generation in the region last year. To kind of put into perspective how rich that region is in solar potential, we looked at the worst potential solar sites in Iraq, and we found that they get around 60% more direct energy from the sun than the best sites in Germany. And I mentioned Germany because it's not exactly blessed with great solar sites, but the solar plants in Germany that the country has built already offer 2.5 times the total electricity capacity that Iraq has, regardless of the technology you're using. So there's so much potential to be tapped that could really go some way towards decarbonizing the local supply. But also, if you're looking at the industries of tomorrow, if you can tap these in the kind of the solar potential, then it could open up avenues for low carbon development across the value chain. So, things like hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen, which a lot of people are speaking about now, that would be one enabler. But one other element of this, okay, so there's the supply side, there's the switching from fossil fuels towards renewables, but there's also the demand side. We really need to think more closely about how we use energy in the region. Now, energy efficiency is not
mainly, isn't it?
Air conditioning, but also buildings efficiency. I mean, when we look at buildings across the region, and because of the kind of immense cooling needs, we found that if just thermal insulation was installed in all buildings, it could reduce the energy consumption in that building by around 60 or 70%.
That's incredible.
So think of that, yeah.
Isn't it? We're pretty short of time, Ali, because your answers are so good. But I just wanted to pick you up on that one comment about hydrogen. Briefly, did you think it's a viable product as a carrier of energy, and which color do you like?
Well, I'm not going to get into the color discussion because we don't generally speak about the different colors. My preference is low carbon, and then I'm agnostic about how that low carbon is generated. But I mean, the hydrogen is already being used today. I think it's something in the region of 90 million tons today. Now, in the trajectories that we think are possible, it could reach something like 200 million tons by 2030. And this could be low carbon, whether you're talking about the use of carbon capture, utilization, and storage on kind of methane reformers, or through what is termed green hydrogen through electrolysis. And that is where it becomes quite interesting because of the solar potential in the region. But like I said, in the roadmaps that we've proposed, we see hydrogen as being kind of an essential cornerstone of future supply. So, like I said, it goes from 90 million tons today to 200 million tons by 2030, and around half of the low carbon hydrogen by 2030 would come from electrolysis, but the remainder would come from the traditional ways through coal, through natural gas, with CCUS attached.
Okay. Let's move. Let's look ahead as we move towards the end of the podcast. The IEA published its long-awaited roadmap for a net zero world by 2050, a roadmap for the global energy sector, which is an apposite title, and it calls for an end to fossil fuel investment. Now, a lot of people are talking about that. Certainly, the major players are. What are your thoughts on the report?
It's a good question, but I must kind of correct the record, Stephen. We don't call for an end to fossil fuel investment. Because what we say is that if the demand changed in the way that the roadmap proposes, then there would be less need for investment in fossil fuels. So it's supply that follows demand, but also, really importantly, it's calling for an end to investment in new fossil fuel production. So existing fossil fuel production would require additional investments, because if we don't have those investments, then the natural decline in the production of currently producing fields would outpace the decline in demand, and then you'd have more demand than you have supply, and then you'll have unbalanced markets, which would cause quite a lot of pain across the energy supply chain across the world. So just a really important distinction. We don't call for an end to fossil fuel production. That's not what we're calling for. But if demand moves in the way it needs to move, then fossil fuel production would need to come down afterwards. So my thoughts are, I think one of the starkest lessons from this roadmap is that despite the pledges we hear today, and despite the kind of momentum that we are seeing in the run-up to COP26, I think there's still a dissonance, a cognitive dissonance that stops people from understanding just how much the supply and demand and the kind of the way we produce and the way we consume energy would need to change for us to meet our climate objectives. It requires a fundamental shift that I think people have not come to terms with. And that if we don't do this, then potentially the targets that we have set ourselves are going to be missed. So that's where I think the report has its value. I think I'd like to stress also that this is one roadmap, one potential pathway. There could be other ways to bring down the emissions profiles of different sectors, etc. But just showing what is possible in the energy sector kind of highlights the fact that this is not going to be an easy journey.
Lastly, Ali, and briefly, if you will, how can the Middle East add value to its hydrocarbon resources? I mean, basically, are high-valued chemicals the answer, with, of course, appropriate carbon capture installed?
It's an excellent question, Stephen. I think there's two ways. By doing what some countries are doing now and ensuring that they remain competitive by producing the lowest emissions barrels or molecules tomorrow. I think they're already moving towards doing this now. When you look at the emissions intensity, for example, of a barrel of oil produced in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, it's about half the global average. And the energy transition is not binary. It's not going to be one day you've got demand for oil and gas and the next day that's ended. People are going to, or investors or the consumer is going to put a value on those low emissions barrels. And so the region is quite well positioned to make the most out of that. And as you say, there are industries in chemicals and petrochemicals that if the emissions are abated, and these are not combusted combustible use of hydrocarbons, then there could be additional value for the region. Then the third thing I'd like to add is things like low carbon hydrogen. I'm quite adamant that the supply chains in the region, the management experience in the region, in the production and export of energy, would stand it in good stead to be able to make that transition.
Well, Ali, thank you for that. I believe that's all we have time for today. Really comprehensive answers. On behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this interview and providing the foundation with those excellent insights. And of course, I look forward to hearing from you again in the future.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
So watch this space for the next Al-Attiyah podcast in the series. I'm Stephen Cole. Thank you and goodbye.